On Monday, the 29th of September, the New York Times published a stunning allegation that top officials in the Trump administration were intensifying their efforts to oust Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. According to the Times, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a longtime opponent of the Maduro regime, is spearheading the push for regime change with support from CIA Director John Ratcliffe and Stephen Miller, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. The revelation came as a shock for most regional observers, because although Trump has long been opposed to Maduro's rule, none of his actions have ever crossed the threshold into regime change territory. During his first term, Trump focused on economic pressure, imposing sanctions on Caracas and rallying other countries to do the same to get the Venezuelan dictator to quit. Trump also denied any involvement with Operation Gideon, a failed coup attempt in May 2020 that led to the arrest of 2 American former Special Forces officers. In the wake of the operation's failure, Trump famously told Fox News, and we'll quote him here, "If I wanted to go into Venezuela, I wouldn't make a secret about it. I'd go in and they would do nothing about it. They would roll over. I wouldn't send a small little group. No. It would be called an army. It would be called an invasion." During his second term in office, the administration has shifted to more aggressive tactics. They've labeled Venezuelan drug cartels, including Cartel of the Suns, as terrorist organizations, carried out military strikes against alleged drug ferrying boats, and raised the bounty on Maduro from $25 million to $50. Yet even the most aggressive of these falls considerably short of what actual regime change would look like. And the question is this by design? The Trump administration may be using these acts to lay the groundwork for potential regime change through military force. In that case, we have to ask, is this the administration's strategy? What does regime change look like? And most importantly, if Maduro is removed from office, what happens next? Regime change justification. Okay, so let's start with the first of our big questions. Is the Trump administration laying the groundwork to justify regime change in Venezuela? Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton believes the answer is yes. Speaking at a panel organized by the Council for Foreign Relations, Clinton argued that the Trump administration is, and we'll quote here, laying the predicate for some kind of military action against Maduro. Now, we've already mentioned some of these possible justifications in our introduction, labeling drug cartels as terror organizations, striking ships in Venezuelan waters, but we haven't mentioned the 2 most significant ones. First, according to the New York Times, President Trump called off efforts led by Special Envoy Richard Grenell to reach an agreement with Venezuela. The negotiations have been going on for months, but heated up recently, and even included President Maduro writing personally to Trump calling for diplomacy and refuting the drug trafficking allegations. As part of these negotiations, Caracas was willing to make substantial economic concessions, including granting American companies access to the country's oil and gas sector, redirecting Venezuelan oil exports away from China toward the US, and reducing Venezuela's economic ties with Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow. However, this wasn't enough to convince President Trump, who had reportedly grown frustrated with President Maduro's failure to give up power and the continued insistence by Venezuelan officials that they're not involved in drug trafficking. The Times reporters believe this has paved the way for potential military escalation against either drug traffickers or Maduro's government. And that leads us to the second and perhaps most important point. The Trump administration recently produced a classified legal opinion that justifies lethal strikes against a secret and expansive list of cartels and suspected drug traffickers. The opinion, first reported on by CNN, argues that the president is allowed to authorize deadly force against a broad range of cartels, including some that the administration has not publicly designated as terrorist organizations because they pose an imminent threat to American citizens. Legal experts believe that this appears to permit an open-ended war against all drug cartels. Sarah Harrison, a former lawyer for the Defense Department currently working as an analyst for the Crisis Group, told CNN, and we'll quote her here, "If the OLC opinion authorizing strikes on cartels is as broad as it seems, it would mean DOJ has interpreted the president to have such extraordinary powers that he alone can decide to prosecute a war far broader than what Congress authorized after the attacks on 9/11. And that might include ousting President Maduro. Let's take a moment to revisit the New York Times story that we mentioned right at the start of today's video. In it, Secretary Rubio described Maduro as a fugitive from American justice and the head of a terrorist organization. He also, and this is the key part here, described Maduro's actions overseeing the flow of drugs into the US as posing an imminent threat to American citizens, which is the exact same language that the Justice Department used in their opinion. Because administration officials view Maduro as the leader of Venezuela's cartel network, they can argue that removing him from power is ultimately a counter-narcotics operation, which would echo the justification used for the 1989 invasion of Panama, where the US overthrew Manuel Noriega on drug trafficking charges. The administration has also notified Congress that the US is engaged in a formal armed conflict with drug cartels, designating them as terrorist organizations and cartel members as unlawful combatants. All of these taken together appear to signal that the Trump administration has constructed a comprehensive legal framework for military action in Venezuela. But it's not just legal groundwork. Troops have already been dispatched to Venezuela's coast. The Wall Street Journal reports that the Pentagon has deployed 3 guided missile destroyers, F-35B fighter jets, MQ-9 Reaper drones, spy planes, assault ships, and a secretive special operations ship. Washington has also deployed 10,000 troops to the region, mostly to bases in Puerto Rico. This is the largest US military buildup in the region in more than 3 decades since the American invasion of Panama. And the troops, they're not just sitting idle. While the strikes on boats have gained the most attention, likely because they've killed more than 20 people so far, the deployment recently conducted an exercise that slipped under the public's radar, but offers clues about what might come next. British outlet The Sunday Times reported that Venezuelan radar detected 5 American F-35 Lightning fighter jets prowling just 46 miles from the coastline at an altitude of roughly 10,700 meters. The Times of London suggests that this could have been an attempt at sussing out the location and effectiveness of Venezuela's air defense systems. Quoting the Times here, using the F-35's electronic warfare system, the American pilots would have been able to map the Russian-made batteries and Chinese radar stations along the Venezuelan coastline, hidden beneath palm trees in strategic locations. Now, in our view, this could be 2 things. Either 1, the exact kind of intelligence gathering that precedes a military strike, or 2, a calculated display meant to remind Maduro's government exactly what's hovering off their coast. Regardless of the intent, Caracas heard the message loud and clear, and the responses ranged from fear to defiance and even excitement. The defiance has come from the usual quarters, the military and politicians allied to Maduro. After the F-35s were detected, Vladimir Lopez, commander-in-chief of the National Bolivarian Armed Forces of Venezuela, addressed a crowd saying that Venezuela was watching the US and would not be intimidated. It is a message that was echoed by Carmen Melendez, the mayor of Caracas, in an interview with The Guardian, where she said if the US dared to invade, the Venezuelan people would be waiting for them. The fear has been best expressed by analysts who can speak freely without needing to toe the party line. Phil Gunson, a Caracas-based analyst for Crisis Group, told The Guardian that Washington's attack on Iran and Tehran's inability to respond had alarmed Maduro's government. The excitement has come from the opposition that is desperate to see the end of Maduro's autocratic 12-year reign, during which Venezuela's economy and democracy have crumbled, millions have fallen into poverty, and millions more have fled abroad. Opposition leader Nobel laureate Maria Corina Machado told the Sunday Times that she supported President Trump's strategy in Venezuela, calling him the biggest opportunity that Venezuela has had to remove the dictator. This complex tapestry of reactions underscores the high stakes of what comes next, which leads us to our second major question: what might regime change actually look like? Intervention scenarios. Regime change, especially in the 21st century when many countries have access to advanced weapons and defense systems, is a difficult task. Difficult, but it ain't impossible. The question then is not whether Washington can topple Nicolas Maduro, but what level of intervention it's willing to stomach to make it happen. So, let's look at 2 possible scenarios, shall we? First, what would happen if the Trump administration decides to put boots on the ground? According to the Latin America Risk Report, one of the leading substacks on regional politics and security, this is the surest path to guaranteeing Maduro's ouster. However, it's also the least likely, with the report estimating the probability of a major US military effort involving serious ground forces inside Venezuela at less than 1%. And for good reason. Venezuela is twice the size of California, and according to the International Institute of Strategic Studies, has an armed forces comprising of 123,000 soldiers, 220,000 civilian militia, and 8,000 reservists. Although Maduro is deeply unpopular among civilians for his economic mismanagement, he has managed to maintain support among the military by granting top officials lucrative state contracts and preferential access to the country's oil reserves. We do have to point out, though, that even this doesn't fully guarantee the army's loyalty. Just look at Sudan, where Generals Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo ousted their longtime patron Omar al-Bashir, despite being granted control of lucrative gold mines. Additionally, a retired Venezuelan general told the AFP that the army's morale was far below what he expected in such a conflict. Still, even with these caveats, America isn't guaranteed an easy victory, a key reason being the number of troops deployed is simply not enough for such a military operation. It falls short of the army Trump promised Fox News back in 2020. Washington would need a lot more manpower, which is a commitment they have shown no indication of making so far. So, what can they do with the troops they do have at the moment? And this is our second scenario, where they can launch a targeted campaign of airstrikes against key locations in Venezuela, including Fort Tiuna, the military base where Maduro is thought to live. There's two likely outcomes in this scenario. One, the airstrikes will ratchet up the tensions in the country, making it untenable for Maduro to stay in office. Two, if Maduro manages to survive, then the pendulum would likely swing back to negotiations. The report views the possibility of limited airstrikes, Maduro's continued stay in power, and an eventual return to the negotiating table as the most likely outcome, assigning it a 75% possibility. We also need to consider how the international community would react if the Trump administration tried to overthrow Maduro by force. Specifically, if any country would step in to save him. Regionally, while Maduro's allies have denounced America's military deployments as illegal and destabilizing, none of them can stand up to Washington. I mean, Caracas's major ally in the region is Cuba. And while Cuba's military has some things it's good at, say hello to Havana Special Forces, it's doubtful that they could tip the balance of conflict in favor of Venezuela. Internationally, Maduro isn't likely to fare any better. According to the South China Morning Post, Beijing is likely to voice its disappointment with American actions, provide economic support for Caracas while avoiding any direct military action that could provoke a direct confrontation with Washington. Experts believe Russia will react much the same way, as the Kremlin is currently still bogged down on day 1329 of its 3-day special military operation in Ukraine. However, these are just predictions. Well thought out and consistent with the information we have at the moment, but they are just predictions nonetheless, and in geopolitics a prediction can be proven wrong 10 minutes after you make it. The day after. Now, we began this piece by spotlighting the New York Times bombshell that top Trump administration officials were intensifying their push for regime change in Venezuela. Even if the analysis that we just presented suggests regime change remains unlikely, we can't ignore what happens if the Venezuela hawks actually get their way. And that brings us to our final question of what happens next? The Venezuelan opposition is confident that once Maduro is ousted, they can swoop in, take power, and restore democracy to the country. Petro Urachurtu, an advisor to Maria Machado, revealed that the opposition has developed a plan for the first 100 hours and 100 days after Maduro's ouster. While the specifics of the plan are not publicly available, we do know that it would involve a transfer of power to Edmundo Gonzalez, who ran for president against Mr. Maduro in 2024. Pretty much every single objective observer on Earth, including Secretary Rubio and this very channel, believes that Gonzalez won the election, but Maduro used his powers as the incumbent to cling on to power. The opposition's view is pretty optimistic and assumes that once Maduro is removed, his allies will subsequently fall in line or not present any challenge at all. We mentioned Sudan earlier to illustrate not just how generals can turn against their longtime patrons, but also because Sudan offers a cautionary tale about what happens after a strongman falls. The civilian opposition assumes they can take power, and the military says, no you don't. Well, Venezuela could potentially follow a similar trajectory, especially if Washington doesn't have the appetite for a long, drawn-out occupation and rebuilding process. The generals who have spent decades enriching themselves might just decide they have too much to lose by handing power to an opposition that probably won't extend the same patronage as the Maduro regime. If they make this decision, they have the guns and the manpower to become a serious thorn for any proposed opposition government, even if it has American support. And we still haven't mentioned the drug cartels. If the Trump administration is right, and Maduro is the kingpin of drug trafficking in Venezuela, then removing him won't eliminate the cartels. Recent history has shown us that removing the head of a drug trafficking operation makes it likely to splinter into smaller, more violent factions competing for control. This is exactly what happened in Ecuador in the last year or so, where an armed crackdown on drug gangs has caused them to splinter into ever smaller yet increasingly violent factions. It's also what happened to Mexico at the start of the drug war, and, well, we've seen what happened there. The worst-case scenario, then, would see various armed factions, the drug cartels, soldiers trying to preserve their wealth, and militias backed by the opposition emerge throughout the country, each carving out their own fiefdoms and fighting for control. and it'll be the Venezuelan people who will be caught in the crossfire, exacerbating one of the world's greatest refugee crises. Now, we need to stress that this is the worst-case scenario, not the inevitable outcome, not even the most likely. Should regime change happen, don't be surprised if the consequences are far more stable than those we just outlined. Still, it would be foolish to undertake something as drastic as the overthrow of a dictator without at least considering the worst possible outcome, a lesson the US should have learned from its time in Iraq. So, what's next for Venezuela? And honestly, we don't know. We're just a YouTube channel, and despite our repeated entreaties, Hegseth still hasn't added us to the Signal group chat. What we do know, though, is that Washington needs to decide whether it is ready to engage in the long-term commitment that stabilizing post-Maduro Venezuela could provide. If not, and the Trump administration really is serious about regime change, then it risks creating a failed state right on its doorstep. Thank you for watching.